Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're exploring personal finance and investing, but with a twist. We're not focusing on formulas or that kind of technical stuff.
Right.
Instead, we're really going to kind of explore this idea of the psychology of money. So how our behaviors and emotions, maybe even our childhoods, influence our decisions about money.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. We think about finance as this very logical mathematical field, but it's so tied up with our psychology, like how we handle money.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we're using Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money. It's full of insightful stories and really timeless wisdom. Why do seemingly smart people make terrible financial choices?
Right.
Can you be wrong half the time and still make a fortune in investing?
Right.
How does your upbringing maybe secretly shape your investment strategy today?
Yeah, and I think one of the key takeaways from the book is that financial success isn't primarily about intelligence, it's about behavior, And sometimes even the smartest people struggle with that.
Totally. And Housel, he tells this story about this executive who just loved to flaunt his wealth.
Yeah.
And there's this story about how he broke a lamp in a restaurant and they told him it was $500 to replace it.
Yeah.
And he just threw $5,000 at the manager and said, "Get out of my face." He just thought money could solve everything.
Oh, wow.
But he ended up going broke.
Yeah.
Just no amount of money can compensate for those bad financial habits.
Exactly. It's not about how much you earn.
Right.
It's about how you manage what you have. And I also contrast that with the story of Ronald Reed, a janitor who secretly amassed an $8 million fortune.
It's incredible.
By patiently investing over decades.
This is so inspiring.
It's just such a great example.
Yeah.
You don't have to be a brilliant, hedge fund manager.
Right.
To build wealth.
Totally.
And that kind of leads to another point that Housel makes, this idea of the sliver of experience, that our personal experiences, which are just a tiny snapshot of all that's happened in the world,
Right.
They disproportionately shape our views on money.
Oh, this resonated with me so much. Why people can have such strong opinions about money, and sometimes those opinions are totally opposite.
Yes.
Someone who, lived through hyperinflation might view cash very differently from someone who's only known stable prices, right?
Exactly. Or think about a stockbroker who navigated the Great Depression. Their risk tolerance would probably be way lower than, say, a young tech worker.
Totally, yeah.
Who's only experienced bull markets.
Right. So recognizing how our own sliver of experience, like you said, might be coloring our financial decisions.
Yeah.
That's key, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
It makes you wonder, are we being overly optimistic or pessimistic?
Yeah.
Based on just our own limited perspective.
Totally. And it also, makes you realize the importance of seeking diverse perspectives. Hearing from people who have different financial backgrounds and experiences.
For sure. And that actually leads to another fascinating idea that Housel brings up, the idea of luck and risk and how they're intertwined. And he uses this great analogy. He says they're like siblings.
Yeah, they're inseparable.
They are inseparable. You can't really talk about one without the other. We often focus on individual skill when we think about success.
Right.
But sometimes we overlook the role of these other external factors.
Like luck.
Like luck.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Take Bill Gates, for example. Obviously, the guy's brilliant, driven.
Of course.
But he also benefited enormously from being in the right place at the right time.
He did, yeah. He went to one of the only schools with a computer at the time. And that sparked his passion for programming.
Yeah.
Who knows what would have happened if he hadn't had that opportunity.
Right.
It's impossible to know.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, someone might make all the right financial decisions, but still face setbacks,
Totally.
A sudden market crash.
A natural disaster.
Totally, yeah.
Just bad luck.
Just bad luck.
Yeah.
Or health issues. So how do we reconcile this? Should we just throw our hands up and say it's all up to fate?
No, I don't think so. I think acknowledging the role of luck doesn't diminish the importance of hard work, smart decisions.
Right.
But it does encourage a more balanced perspective. We shouldn't beat ourselves up over every setback.
Right.
But we also shouldn't become overly confident.
Right. When we're doing well. Yeah, that's such a good point. It's about recognizing that there are forces at play that we can't control.
Yeah.
But also understanding we still have a role to play in shaping our financial outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And speaking of shaping outcomes, Housel talks about this idea of enough.
Yes.
This kind of fascinating exploration of how we define wealth and contentment.
Yeah.
And he has this story about author Joseph Heller at a party hosted by this, like, billionaire. And the billionaire was bragging about his daily earnings. And Heller just responded, yes, but I have something he will never have. Enough.
Wow.
Isn't that a powerful statement?
It is, yeah. Really makes you think about what matters.
Like, what truly matters? Is it about accumulating more and more wealth? Or is it about reaching a point where you just feel content and secure?
Yeah, and I think it challenges our tendency to always want more.
Totally.
You know, we assume that more money will bring more happiness, but that's not always the case.
Right. And Housel actually shares kind of a cautionary tale about this guy, Rajat Gupta. He was this highly successful businessman. But despite his wealth, he got involved in insider trading. Just this desire for more.
Yeah.
And it cost him everything. So, like, even those who achieve great success can still, fall prey to this allure of more.
Absolutely.
And unchecked ambition can have these really devastating consequences. So how do we define enough for ourselves?
Yeah.
And how do we avoid falling into that trap of just always wanting more?
Yeah, I think that's a question we all have to answer for ourselves.
It is, yeah. It makes me wonder, what would it look like for me to have enough? What would that level of, like, financial security and contentment feel like?
Yeah, it's a very personal question.
It is.
But I think it's an important one to reflect on, because if we don't define enough for ourselves,
Right.
we risk getting caught in this never-ending cycle, just wanting more and more and more.
Totally, which just leads to stress, anxiety, and ultimately, I think, unhappiness.
For sure.
Absolutely. So it's about finding that balance between striving for, financial security,
Right.
but also appreciating what we already have.
Yeah.
And recognizing that true wealth isn't just about money.
Yeah.
It's about having that freedom to live a life that aligns with our values and brings us joy.
Well said. And, that brings us to probably one of the most powerful concepts in finance.
Right.
Compounding.
Okay.
This is, it's been called the eighth wonder of the world. Wow.
And Housel uses this really cool analogy. He compares it to an ice age.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me about this ice age analogy.
So just as, like, small, gradual changes in temperature can, over time, lead to these massive ice sheets forming, small, consistent savings and investments can grow into, like, extraordinary wealth.
Okay.
Over the long term through the power of compounding.
So it's not about, making a single, massive investment.
Right.
It's about the consistency.
Exactly. Consistency and time.
Over time, got it.
Yeah, it's like rolling a snowball down a hill.
Okay.
At first, the snowball's small. The growth seems insignificant. But as it rolls, it picks up more snow, gets bigger and bigger, and that growth accelerates.
That makes perfect sense. But does this really apply to, everyday people? Or just, people with tons of money to invest?
No, it applies to everyone.
Yeah.
Like, that's the beauty of compounding. It doesn't discriminate. Even small amounts invested consistently over time can grow significantly. I mean, think about it. Almost all of Warren Buffett's wealth
Is attributed to the fact that he's been investing for, over 70 years.
Wow. So it's not just about being a brilliant investor. It's about having that discipline to save and invest consistently over the long haul.
Exactly. Time is your greatest ally when it comes to building wealth. And, that leads to another important concept, survival. Often the most important financial skill is simply staying in the game long enough to let compounding work its magic.
Right. This makes me think about, all those stories you hear about people who panic and sell all their investments during a market downturn.
Right.
And then they miss out on the eventual recovery if they're not in the game anymore.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Staying the course during turbulent times is essential.
Right.
It's like a marathon, not a sprint. You're going to face challenges, setbacks along the way, but if you can endure those challenges, you're more likely to reach the finish line.
So how do we ensure we survive those inevitable market ups and downs?
Well, Housel emphasizes the importance of having a margin of safety in your finances. Think of it as a buffer to cushion against unexpected events.
Like having an emergency fund.
Exactly. Having 3 to 6 months of living expenses saved, it can give you peace of mind.
Right.
It allows you to ride out those financial storms without making rash decisions. It also means not overextending yourself with debt.
Right.
Making sure you can handle those monthly payments, even if things get tight.
Yeah, this is such practical advice. It's not about getting rich quick. It's about building that solid foundation
Exactly.
that can withstand the ups and downs of life.
It's about creating a sense of financial security and resilience that allows you to pursue your goals with confidence.
Right. And speaking of security, this next point from Housel, it really got me thinking. He talks about how wealth is often what you don't see.
Yes.
And he observed this when he was working as a valet. He'd see these people driving expensive cars and flashing designer labels, but maybe didn't have the financial security to back it up.
Yeah. It challenges our preconceived notions of like what it means to be wealthy.
Right.
Like, is it about outward appearances and material possessions?
Right.
Or is it about having financial freedom and peace of mind?
Right. It's like that saying, don't judge a book by its cover.
Exactly.
Someone might look wealthy on the outside, but behind closed doors, they might be struggling to make ends meet.
Right.
Yeah. So it's a reminder that true wealth is often hidden.
Yeah.
It's about building that strong financial foundation through, disciplined saving, smart investing, and living below your means.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So it's not about keeping up with the Joneses. It's about defining your own version of wealth and success.
I love that. And that leads to another key point that I found really thought-provoking.
Okay.
This idea of a freedom fund.
A freedom fund. Okay. What is that?
Yeah, it's the idea of building this financial cushion that gives you options and control over your time.
Yeah.
It's not about accumulating vast sums of money just for the sake of it.
Right.
It's about having the financial security to pursue your passions, take risks, and live a life that aligns with your values.
I love that. This resonates with me so much because, I remember working this job a few years ago. I wasn't passionate about it at all, but I saved every penny I could so that I could eventually quit and pursue music.
Oh, wow.
And having that freedom fund, it gave me the confidence to take that leap.
That's awesome. That's a really powerful example.
It's not even about getting rich. It was about buying myself the time and freedom to do what I loved.
And that's the essence of a freedom fund, right? It's about aligning your financial goals with your personal values, aspirations.
Absolutely.
It's about having that financial security to make choices that are in your best interest, even if those choices don't lead to the highest immediate financial gain.
That's such an important distinction.
Yeah.
It's not about chasing money for the sake of money. It's about using money as a tool to create a life that you love.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that money is a means to an end.
Yes.
Not an end in itself.
It's not the end goal, right?
Yeah.
So, if you could design your ideal lifestyle, how much money would you actually need? What trade-offs are you willing to make between time, money, and happiness? These are questions we all need to be asking ourselves.
Absolutely. And those are questions we'll continue exploring in the next part of our deep dive into the psychology of money.
I'm excited.
One thing that really struck me, in the psychology of money is how Housel challenges this idea that there's some magic formula for financial success.
Right.
He argues that, what worked in the past might not work in the present, and what works today might not work in the future.
That's so true. It's like those investing books that are here are the secrets to getting rich. And then you try to apply their strategies.
Yeah.
And they just don't seem to work anymore.
Exactly. The financial landscape is constantly changing. Housel uses the example of Benjamin Graham. He's considered the father of value investing. His book, The Intelligent Investor, it's a classic, but some of the specific formulas he advocated for back in the day just don't hold up in today's market.
So are you saying his advice is outdated?
Not necessarily. I mean, Graham himself was a very successful investor, but he was also adaptable.
Okay.
He recognized that the market was always evolving,
Right.
and he adjusted his strategies accordingly.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's like trying to use a 1950s map
Right.
to navigate a modern city. The landmarks might still be there, but the roads and traffic patterns
That's way different.
have totally changed.
It's a reminder that we need to be lifelong learners when it comes to finance. We can't just rely on outdated strategies or assume that what worked for someone else will automatically work for us.
Right. So we need to be adaptable, willing to learn new things.
For sure. And we also need to be realistic about risk.
Okay.
Housel makes this really interesting comparison between trying to get something for nothing in the financial world
Okay.
and shoplifting.
Okay. I'm curious. How is investing like shoplifting?
Well, he argues that every investment comes with some level of risk.
Right.
And trying to avoid that risk is like trying to steal something. You might get away with it for a while, but eventually there will be consequences.
So we need to just acknowledge that there's no such thing as a free lunch in investing.
Pretty much, yeah. Every potential reward comes with a corresponding risk. He gives the example of like buying a car.
Okay.
You can pay full price, you could try to find a cheaper used car,
Right.
or you could try to steal one.
I think we all understand why stealing a car is a bad idea.
Right, exactly. But sometimes when it comes to investing, we fall into that trap of thinking we can get those market returns without accepting any volatility or risk.
So how do we navigate that risk? Like, how do we find that balance between seeking returns,
Right.
but also protecting ourselves?
Yeah, that's where diversification, risk management, and having a long-term perspective come in.
Okay.
It's also about being honest with yourself about your own risk tolerance.
This makes me think about those stories of companies trying to manipulate their earnings
Yes.
to meet Wall Street's expectations. Housel talks about Jack Welch, the former CEO of GE. He was notorious for this.
Ah, yes. The quest for smooth, predictable growth.
Yeah.
It's a tempting but often dangerous illusion. I mean, Welch managed to maintain that facade for a while, but it ultimately caught up with him and GE shareholders paid the price.
Yeah, you can't defy the laws of financial gravity forever.
Exactly. There are no shortcuts. Sustainable wealth creation is built on a foundation of, informed decision-making, prudent risk management, and a long-term perspective.
Speaking of long-term perspective, what about bubbles? How do we avoid getting caught up in those periods of like irrational exuberance where everyone seems to be making money,
Right.
but then it all comes crashing down?
Yeah, bubbles are they're fascinating phenomena driven by this complex mix of psychology, economics, and often a bit of FOMO, fear of missing out.
Yeah. It's like that game of musical chairs where everyone keeps dancing and investing as long as the music is playing, but eventually the music stops and someone's left without a chair.
That's a great analogy. And in the case of a financial bubble, that someone can be a lot of people
Right.
holding overvalued assets when the bubble bursts.
So how do we recognize a bubble before it bursts?
That's the tricky part. Sometimes it's obvious in hindsight,
Right.
but in the moment, it can be difficult to distinguish between a genuine boom and an unsustainable bubble.
Right. Like I've heard people say, this time it's different.
Right.
Does that ever hold true?
I mean, sometimes it is different, but those are the rare exceptions.
Okay.
Most of the time, those words are a sign that people are getting caught up in the hype
Right.
and ignoring the fundamentals.
So what should we be looking for? Like, what are some signs?
Well, pay attention to valuations.
Okay.
Are asset prices rising much faster than underlying earnings or fundamentals? Is there a lot of hype and speculation driving the market rather than solid business fundamentals?
So we need to be skeptical, not just follow the crowd.
Exactly. It's important to do your own research, understand the underlying assets you're investing in,
Right.
and not get swept up in the emotional frenzy of a potential bubble.
But what if we miss out on some big gains by being too cautious?
That's always a possibility.
Right.
But remember, it's better to miss out on some gains than to lose a significant portion of your savings in a bubble that bursts.
That's a good point. Yeah. It's about finding that balance between participating in the market,
Right.
but also protecting yourself from unnecessary risk.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that even the smartest investors get things wrong sometimes. Housel shares this great quote from Peter Lynch. He's one of the greatest investors of all time. He says, if you're terrific in this business, you're right 6 times out of 10.
Wow. Only 6 times out of 10.
Yeah.
That's a pretty humbling statistic.
It is. It's a reminder that we need to be humble. Recognize that we won't always make the right call.
Right. So it's not about being perfect.
Right.
It's about learning from our mistakes
Exactly.
and continuing to improve.
And it's about managing risk. So even if we make some wrong calls, we don't wipe out our entire portfolio.
That's a great point. Yeah, it's about being able to bounce back from those setbacks and stay in the game for the long haul.
Exactly. And this kind of leads to another interesting observation that Housel makes.
Okay.
He talks about how we often underestimate the role of narrative in shaping our financial decisions.
What do you mean by narrative?
Well, think about the stories we tell ourselves about the world, about money, about success. These narratives can have a really powerful influence on our behavior, even if those stories aren't entirely accurate or rational.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, think about the 2008 financial crisis. Part of what fueled that downturn was this loss of confidence, driven by these negative narratives that spread like wildfire. People panicked, they sold their assets, and the economy just spiraled downward.
So it was like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
In a way, yes. The stories we tell ourselves can become our reality, even if those stories are based on fear or misinformation. And these narratives are often contagious. They spread through the media, through social networks, through our conversations with friends and family.
That's a bit scary, I have to admit. It makes you realize how easily we can be influenced by the narratives that we're exposed to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which is why it's so crucial to be aware of those narratives and to cultivate those critical thinking skills that allow us to evaluate information objectively. We need to question those stories we're being told, especially when those stories are designed to elicit fear or greed.
So it's about being mindful of the information we're consuming and being able to, filter out the noise.
Exactly. And it's also about recognizing the narratives we're telling ourselves.
Right, okay.
Those internal stories about our own financial capabilities and limitations.
That's an interesting point. What kind of stories are we telling ourselves about money? Are we telling ourselves a story of, scarcity and struggle?
Right.
Or a story of abundance and possibility?
Right.
Right? That's a good question, because the stories we tell ourselves can have such a big impact.
Absolutely.
On our financial decisions, our overall well-being.
Our whole lives, yeah.
Yeah, this whole idea of narrative is so fascinating. It makes you realize there's so much more to finance than just numbers and formulas. It's about psychology, sociology, and even storytelling.
It's about human behavior.
It is.
Yeah.
And that's what makes personal finance so interesting. It's not just about managing money. It's about understanding human behavior, our own biases,
Totally.
the forces that shape our perceptions and decisions. Okay, before we wrap up this part, there's one last story from the book I'd love to dive into. It's about how the modern American consumer came to be, and it connects all the way back to World War II.
Ooh, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Okay, so Housel talks about how after World War II ended in 1945, there was this huge concern about the U.S. economy, potentially slipping back into a depression.
Right.
Because, they'd just come out of the Great Depression in the 1930s.
Yeah.
And nobody wanted to see that happen again.
Of course. Yeah, the war had such a massive impact on everything. Industries, jobs, global trade.
Right.
It makes sense that policymakers would be worried about things taking a downturn.
Exactly. So they made this decision to keep interest rates really low.
Okay.
And that was meant to encourage people to spend money and kind of stimulate economic activity.
Yeah, right.
But it wasn't a simple choice.
Yeah.
Because there was already a lot of pent-up demand for goods and services.
Oh, sure.
After the war years.
Yeah.
So that meant inflation was a real worry.
Yeah, that's a classic economic dilemma.
It is.
Lower interest rates, they can be great for boosting spending,
Right.
getting things moving again. But yeah, they can also lead to inflation if things heat up too quickly.
For sure. And there was another kind of goal at play, too.
Okay.
Policymakers, they really wanted to create what they called the American consumer.
Okay.
They wanted people to buy homes and cars, appliances, all those things that were in short supply during the war.
Makes sense.
So they started loosening credit regulations.
Okay.
And that's actually how the first credit card was introduced in 1950.
Wow. So that's how the credit card era began.
It is.
It's amazing to think about how that single invention, transformed the way we spend and manage money.
It really did.
Wow.
And this combination of low interest rates and easier access to credit, it had a huge impact.
Yeah.
People started buying homes and cars like never before.
Right.
And this, along with this productivity boom that was already underway, it just led to this period of incredible economic growth.
So it was like a perfect storm of factors coming together.
Right.
Totally pent-up demand, access to credit, increased productivity. It's no wonder the economy just took off.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that this economic boom was pretty evenly spread.
Okay.
Wages were rising for most people, not just the wealthy.
Wow.
There was this sense of shared prosperity. The gap between the rich and the poor actually shrank during this time.
That's a stark contrast to the rising income inequality we've seen in more recent decades.
It is.
It's a reminder that economic growth can be inclusive,
Yeah.
and benefit a broad cross-section of society.
It can, for sure. Yeah. And people often talk about this time as the golden age of capitalism, when the American middle class really thrived.
Yeah.
Of course, it wasn't perfect. There were still major social and racial inequalities. But economically, it was a pretty good time for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's important to acknowledge both the progress that was made, but also the inequalities that persist.
For sure.
Because those inequalities continued to cast this long shadow, shaping, the socioeconomic landscape for generations to come.
Absolutely. But then things started to shift in the 1970s.
Uh-huh.
Globalization, competition from other countries, and a shift away from manufacturing towards a more service-based economy.
Right.
All of that led to slower economic growth and a widening gap between the rich and the poor.
Yeah, this period really marked kind of a turning point
It did.
in the American economic narrative, right?
Yeah.
The forces of globalization, technological change, they really started to reshape industries and labor markets. And those benefits of economic growth, they were no longer as widely shared.
Right. But here's the thing. Even as the economic reality was changing, people's expectations, like their aspirations for a certain standard of living,
Yeah.
they kind of remained anchored in that post-war era of shared prosperity.
That's a really crucial point, yeah. It creates this disconnect
It does.
between what people expected
Right.
and what the economy could actually deliver.
Exactly. You had this situation where people were still striving for that, like middle-class lifestyle, a home, a car, a good education for their kids.
Yeah.
Even though it was becoming increasingly difficult to achieve.
Right.
And what did they do to bridge that gap? They took on more debt.
Yeah, it makes sense. If your income isn't keeping up with your expectations, taking on debt can seem like the only way to, maintain your lifestyle.
Totally. Yeah. Homes got bigger. Cars got fancier. The cost of college skyrocketed.
Mhm.
Credit card debt became the norm.
Wow.
People were stretching themselves thin, trying to keep up with this lifestyle that was like increasingly out of reach.
Yeah, it's a classic example of keeping up with the Joneses.
It is.
We often measure our own success and happiness against those around us.
Right.
And that can lead to this cycle of overspending and debt.
And that brings us to today. We're still dealing with this legacy of consumerism and debt,
Yeah.
even as the economic landscape continues to evolve.
It's a powerful reminder that understanding our financial history can help us make sense of,
Yeah.
our present behaviors and expectations.
Totally.
It allows us to question those like outdated norms
Right.
and make more conscious choices that align with our values and goals.
It's like a call to action for all of us.
Yeah.
What can we learn from this history? How can we break free from these patterns of overconsumption and debt
Right.
and create a more sustainable and fulfilling relationship with money?
It starts with recognizing that true wealth isn't about, the size of your house or the car you drive. It's
Okay.
about having financial security, freedom, and the ability to live a life that, truly aligns with your values.
Yeah, it's about defining what enough truly means to you
Absolutely.
and making choices that support that definition
Yes.
rather than chasing, an ever-shifting standard of living that's
Yeah.
dictated by societal pressures.
Yeah, and it's about remembering that you have the power to rewrite your own financial narrative.
I love that.
You can choose to focus on abundance and possibility rather than scarcity and fear.
Well, there you have it. We've explored the psychology of money, uncovered the hidden forces that shape our financial decisions, and I hope you found this deep dive as insightful and thought-provoking as we have.
Me too.
Remember, understanding the psychology of money is a key step towards unlocking your financial freedom and creating a life of abundance and purpose.
Couldn't agree more. It's been a fascinating journey, and I encourage you to keep exploring these ideas and apply them to your own financial life, Every choice you make, every dollar you spend or save, it's a step towards building the future you envision.
I love that. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep seeking knowledge.